The ASA virtual firewall, taking one physical device and making multiple virtual machines out of it. That's what this MicroNugget is all about. Let's jump in. Our objectives in this MicroNugget are really simple. We want to identify what a virtual firewall is and why we'd use it. Then we'll take a look at how they pull it off and how you'd manage such a thing. Let's start off with a small company that has two departments that are on the network. We have the Human Resources Department and we have Sales. And currently, they both have separate interfaces off of the existing ASA firewall, and they have their own VLANs. Maybe this is the 10.0.0 network on VLAN 20, and down here we have the 10.2.2 network, and that's on its own separate VLAN as well. And life is good until one day they came to us and they said, hey, can you help us? We want to manage our own firewall policies. We're going to hire some staff. We want to manage our own firewall policies. HR and sales both want to manage their own, but we have one physical firewall. The challenge is if we give them both full access, either one of them could cause damage to the other inadvertently or on purpose. So to solve that, what we could do is we could take this one physical firewall and logically carve it up into two pieces. So we're going to go left to right here. We could have this for human resources, where they have their inside network, the outside network, and then we could go ahead and for sales, create a separate virtual firewall with their inside and their outside. And you'll notice where we can actually share interfaces as well. So once we carve this up, whenever they want to make changes to their firewall, to their logical firewall, they make their changes on their access list, to the modular policy framework, to the network address translation. Anything HR admins change on their virtual firewall doesn't affect the sales virtual firewall, and vice versa. So our next task is how exactly did they pull this off, those guys at Cisco? How did they make this happen? And to do virtualization, basically we're imitating what really normally happens. For example, in a world of a PC, what does a PC do? When it powers on, it takes a look at the hardware that's available, and it loads off the hard drive, and then it runs. Well, if we virtualize a PC, we have a file that it reads, and that file has the information on, okay, this hardware is available to you, and it's all emulated. Well, what we do on the ASA is we have a system configuration file, and that system configuration file is what we boot to. And the system configuration file says, okay, I've got a context called CTX1, and it has these interfaces that it's using. I've got another context called CTX2, and it's got these interfaces that it's using. It also is going to specify where the configuration file is for both of those. CTX1 is going to have a configuration file, maybe it's configuration file A that's stored on flash, and the second context is going to have a different configuration file stored on flash. So their little mini-me versions of their startup configs are stored in files, and that's how the system pulls it off. We boot to the system config, then we bring up the context, reading in when they boot up the contents of their startup configuration file. So the last piece is, okay, so how do you manage something like this now that it's up? Well, to do that, it's really simple. We can manage it from the command line, or we can use ASDM, or a combination of both. Let's go to the command line first. At the command line interface, what's going to be very helpful is realizing we have different areas that we can go into. Now we have the system execution space, and that's recognized by the prompt just saying, this is ASA1, the firewall. It's the high-level system execution space where we can create new context, allocate interfaces, but it's not the actual configuration for the context themselves. If we want to go into the various contexts, for example, CTX1 or CTX2, what we would do is we would change. So this is system context. I'm saying show context. It says, hey, Keith, you've got a couple contexts. They've got some interfaces allocated to them respectively. And here, these are the startup configs. This is the startup config for context 2. That's the startup config currently assigned to context 1. If we want to change to one of those contexts to start managing it from the command line, we simply use this command right here. Change to context, the name of the context, and poof, look at the prompt. It changed. And that means we are now logically inside of that configuration for that specific context. And we can change back with a change to command that goes back to system, and it changes the prompt back. So from the command line, we have three different areas we can be in. We can be in the system execution space, we can go down to context 1 or go into context 2, and the prompt is going to respond or reflect the context that we're currently in. So on the command line, we can change by using the change to command. We can go to any context we want to. We can navigate to the system execution space. How do we do it in ASDM in the GUI? Well, that might be a trick because we have to go to view and specify that we want the device list. Now from the device list right here, we can go ahead and select where we want to go. So if you want to look at the system execution space, you can just double click on that, and this is the system execution space. You want to create a new context? Great. You simply go to security context, Click on Add and add a new one. Also from here, we can specify the interfaces that are allocated, the configuration URL for the startup config for each of the contexts. And if we want to go in and manage one of the contexts, we go back to the device list, go like, for example, CTX1 by double clicking. The prompt changes up here, and now we're managing that specific firewall with network address translation, access control list, service policy rules, and everything else that we would normally see on the firewall. The last thing we should do really is to verify that this actually works. And to do that, let's bring up a client on each of these subnets just to verify that we have connectivity through. So we'll bring up an XP client here, we'll bring up a Linux box here, and just to make sure that they both have access through their own virtual firewall going out to the internet. So to test this XP box is going through the virtual context number 1. So we'll simply go out to a website like CBT Nuggets, verify that it works, and brings it up, which it does. And also we can go on the Unix box, which is going through the context 2, we'll just do a quick ping out to 8888 to verify they're both working. And then from the command line, if we want to leverage the command line, we bring it up, we say, you know what, we're in context 1, let's change to system. So now we're in the system execution space, and from here we can verify what context we have. It's going to show both contexts. If we want to move into context 1, we simply say change to go there. And then inside of that context, we can do a show xlate to see the layer 3 translations. That's the translations from our inside IP addresses to the outside addresses. And then we can take a look at the connections that are currently used, that are being brought up by our trip out to cbtnuggets.com. So again, just the actual management of the firewall from the command line is the same as it would be as if you had a single physical firewall. It's just navigating to the right context to issue the right command. In this MicroNugget, we've taken a look at the concept of a virtual firewall, a physical firewall that has been chopped up into logical smaller pieces. The magic is done by changing the way the firewall thinks. It boots up, and instead of looking for interfaces, the system space looks for the context, what interfaces are allocated to them, and where the startup config is for those contexts. Once they're up and running, we can use our same management tools, the command line interface, either at the console or through SSH. We're using the change to command to go to the right context or system execution space to manage the firewall. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.